Hello, and welcome to the Radiant Astrology Podcast. I'm your host, Christina Caudill. And in today's episode, we're going to be talking about one of the transits that seems to be on just about everybody's mind who follows astrology, and that is Chiron in Taurus, which is coming up quickly for us. And with me to discuss that is my friend and colleague, the astrologer Gray Crawford. Hi, Gray. Thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here and talking about Chiron. Yeah, we're only, as you and I are talking, it is 2 weeks away. So
Oh, wow.
it's pretty wild how close we are to Chiron going into Taurus.
And, I will say, as someone who is native Chiron in Aries, I know you are too, and we've both had our Chiron returns. I think we can talk a little more expertly on, on Chiron after having our Chiron returns. But, of course, the good news for people with Chiron and Aries is we're like, oh, we can finally breathe a little bit with Chiron moving into the next sign. However, sadly, I think it's important we, talk about the dates because Chiron is not done with Aries yet, right? So we can't get too
No.
ahead of ourselves.
Yeah, no, not at all. So it's it's only a small part of 2026 that Chiron will be in Taurus. And so I know there are some people that are really into Chiron that are, like you're saying, it's really on their mind and they're thinking a lot about it and they realize that it's a really important thing just to be there for a few months. But I think if you're not somebody already giving a lot of significance to Chiron, it might be something you aren't paying as much attention to, perhaps just because there are so many really loud, big things going on in the same time period that Chiron will be in Taurus, which is especially Jupiter coming into Leo and opposing Pluto, and we get this like cradle configuration that S.J. Anderson's made that Barbo basket term pretty popular. But we get all these like exact, Uranus exactly trine Pluto and exactly sextile Aries and Jupiter, they're all forming these exact aspects. And that's all going to come in while Chiron is in Taurus. So it's just from June 19th until September 17th. And then Chiron will go back to Aries and it will eventually station retrograde on January 6th of 2027 at about 26 degrees and 15 minutes or so of Aries. So between 26 and 27 degrees of Aries. So that first week of January next year is when Chiron comes back, stations. So, like you're saying, those of us that have Chiron and Aries, we've been having our Chiron return. You and I were born around the same time, so we've already had our exact Chiron returns. But we still probably have some final lessons, coming up. We're not going to be totally done with it with Chiron coming into Taurus. Also, if you have personal planets in that last 5 degree range of Aries, Chiron is coming back there just because it's leaving, and you might be going through a big Chiron and Aries transit right now as you and I are talking, but it will come back. But then it will end up on April 14th, coming back into Taurus next year in 2027. And the Sun will then form a conjunction with Chiron and Taurus almost immediately on April 20th. And it will basically be there um, until 2033, essentially. So we have a big transit coming up, and it's going to be in Taurus, for a considerable length of time. And we've seen this before when planets just even like, sometimes Chiron isn't given the same weight as like a Pluto transit, but Chiron transits really are significant and they are significant collectively. If you remember when Pluto just went into Aquarius for a little bit in 2021, that was still really significant. We clearly got these Pluto and Aquarius themes coming in really strongly. And, even myself as someone that's really into Chiron, because there are so many other things going on this year, it's not necessarily like the most major thing that jumps out. But it actually, the more I've thought about it and the more, especially the more we've gotten close to it happening and seeing all the things going on collectively, the more important I've been feeling it will be, and also really recognizing how powerfully the themes of Chiron and Taurus are showing up in the world as we are getting near it. Among other things, being this looming potential. We don't really know yet where it's going to go, but the fact that there could be this very significant global economic crisis. There's certainly something already going on in many places with oil and the fertilizer and the impact on food supply has already made a lot of big news coming into this time period that you and I are talking now, and it's still something just kind of looming in the background. And this is something that we see with past Chiron and Taurus transits, including even the collapse of the financial markets that led into the Great Depression was a previous Chiron and Taurus time. So those are
Yeah.
yeah. Hmm.
I wanted to ask about that because that is what I have at least just been seeing, when people chatting about Chiron and Taurus online is the main thing they're worried about is a financial crisis. I feel like, and I think we could go and one would need to analyze the chart of the Wall Street crash that you're referring to, and that was what is that was that the 30s, 1930 or something like that. Um,
Leading into it, yeah. Hmm.
Getting into it because when we think about the archetype of Chiron and then the archetypes of Taurus, as you said, it seems to be a sort of a quieter thing. When we think of like a big crash or something, we think of the outer planets, that make this big sort of shock and awe. But it's actually when I think of Chiron being again the wound that doesn't heal, the wound that really kind of hurts us at our most vulnerable areas, and Taurus being about survival, biological survival, self-sufficiency, having enough or the lack thereof, poverty consciousness, things like that. Um, so I almost think that, does Chiron in Taurus, does it indicate the crash or does it indicate more of like the feeling, the collective feeling of maybe not having enough, whether or not it is, legitimately true or not, but that essentially the poverty consciousness that sort of, that will obviously, I guess, if we have Taurus um, planets or points in our chart, or if we're having a Chiron, transit that's activating our natal chart, we may feel more immediately. But of course, the collective will sense something like that too. So, do you think what is Chiron indicating to you? Is it sort of like that collective tone of lack or not having enough?
Well, I mean, the way I'm thinking about it is more in terms of where does so two of the big things that are going on to me are one, now we are facing this potential economic crisis, and a lot of people are feeling insecurities around finances, and um, simultaneously with that is this massive technological disruption. And with that technological disruption, on one hand, we have things like these massive data centers coming in that are also going to potentially take up all these resources, which could also put people in that kind of a mindset. And then all these big advances with AI and other things, but this is also leading to places slashing jobs and getting rid of positions or things being devalued. So what I feel like is, so what's becoming really alive to me with Chiron and Taurus is Not so much that that's going on, but more where does Chiron in Taurus lead us as a guide? And I do see Chiron ultimately as a mentor and guide figure, although at the same time it definitely does speak to deep wounds and conflicts. It's all sort of just comes together at the same time. So there'll be, big wounding experiences around some of these themes of Taurus that we can talk more about. But looking at some of the research I've done with past history, we get these periods where economic collapses or uncertainty, or also like big industrial expansion. There's been periods of great monopolies coming in, um, increases of capitalism that then lead to things like labor revolts. People also really reassessing what's valuable. Movements coming in that are somewhat the antithesis of what's happening. So in this time of all this technological advances coming in, actually going back to more like slow processes of slow crafts. Somebody that's really famous for being associated with the art and craft movement of the 19th century is William Morris. And William Morris was born with Chiron and Taurus, a square, a Mars and Uranus conjunction um, in Aquarius. And by the time he was having his Chiron return, so he's born in like the period of like the 1828 to 1834 Chiron and Taurus group. And when Chiron and Taurus comes back in around 1876 to 1883 time period, his work was already really known, but that was a time period where a lot of that arts and craft movement was really building more and more, and there was more associations being coming together. And a thing that I think it's also interesting with that particular time period was in 1882, there was a Saturn Neptune conjunction in Taurus that also had Chiron in Taurus about 6 degrees away. And something about that really speaks to me somewhat to what we're having now. When Saturn and Neptune came together in the first degree of Aries earlier this year, Chiron was much further along in Aries, but they were still sharing the sign. And that 1882 Saturn Neptune conjunction in Taurus, where Chiron was closer, that was right when Thomas Edison like lights up a big city block with electricity, and that's an event that's often really associated with this like electrical age and like city lights and this whole age of electricity, and the way that disrupts so many things forever, and our human consciousness is forever changed by artificial lighting instead of being in these light day night more rhythms.
Um,
Lights can be on all the time, so like that's an interesting one to me, that just I think the way all this is changing right now. Yeah. And, we're also seeing mass political corruption of a pretty incredible scale, just because it's so like out in the open, and not even like you don't even have to be a conspiracy theorist to just see really blatant political corruption going on. And so I do wonder about how does this turn people within, and reassess their values, and actually also start to working towards making change in the world. Somebody else that has Chiron and Taurus was Martin Luther King, who is actually Taurus rising with Jupiter and Taurus, not far from Chiron and Taurus. Now, if you're using whole sign, that would all be in his first house. If you're using another house system, it would be above the ascendant. But that Jupiter and Taurus he has that's close to his Chiron. Also, he has all these Pisces placements that are ruled by that Jupiter. So he has like Venus in Pisces and the Moon in Pisces that are really important to his chart. So, and, he's a figure that starts out organizing all these great civil rights protests.
I think it was called the Poor People's Revolution, and I
Hmm.
think one of the movements of his. Wow, that is really interesting. And the Poor People's Campaign, I believe.
Hmm.
And it's interesting because there's been so much attention, as you said, on some of the bigger, louder things like Pluto and Aquarius. And it does seem like a lot of these mass movements are, have been about asserting our rights, the no kings. We have to get out and fight the Chiron in Aries, fight for our rights, fight for our freedoms. And, perhaps the Chiron in Taurus will be how is it going to feed into all these other things that are happening? For instance, the Pluto and Aquarius, maybe the mass movements may finally be we can't afford gas, or like a lot of times these financial things in the background. And it isn't always enough to take people to the streets, but maybe
Hmm.
that's what we will see more of is people are actually finally pinched to the point, or feel like that
Yeah.
that is part of that motivation, to collectively unite.
Well, the last time we had Chiron and Taurus was that 1973 to 83 is basically the really rough estimation of that. Um, Although I guess it did come in a little bit in 1976 as well, and then it like May 28th to October 13th to 76, then it went back to Aries, and then it came back to Taurus for good in March of 19 end of March of 1977. So that period with like Iran being dominating things with the wars there in the Strait of Hormuz, of course that was the previous Chiron and Taurus was the Iranian Revolution, and that whole time period had a lot of inflation as well. And that whole time period also had a lot of political corruption. And it's one of the things that it makes me think also about that time period, which is important because it's something we need to talk about, is that was also the time period when Chiron was discovered. But when Chiron was discovered, Chiron was at about 3 degrees of Taurus. And in that time period, some of the movements that were emerging were things like punk rock as well as hip hop music. And these were very, to me, Chiron and Taurus types of things in terms of movements that were really involving a lot of art and but also tied in with values. And punk rock is something that's a really interesting force that really emerged into the music scene at that time in a real act of rebellion. And in fact, one of the I was just my partners from Australia, and we were just from Brisbane, and we were just watching a documentary about the Saints, which is a punk band from Brisbane. And I wasn't, she was showing me how, like, I didn't realize that they were the first band to actually self release like a proper punk rock album. And the government in Brisbane was just really, it was like a police state at the time. And we just have, I don't know, what gets going now in this upcoming time period, but this like people, I think not only protesting things and getting more into the street and reconnect. I think there's something about Chiron and Taurus that can hopefully help us reconnect in the end with something sacred within ourselves, with something about our soul and spirit and other systems of value, and wanting to, do something create because it is still Taurus. So, you know, Chiron doesn't mean I do not work with Chiron in a way that Chiron just means you can't do anything with this sign. And it's actually, it can be very creative, and it works with these whatever those hardships are, sort of catalyzes something. And because it is the Chiron return, that is so huge. So it will be June 8th of 2027, right around that time, that Chiron will come back to where it was when it was discovered. So basically, 1 year from when, a little bit over a year from when you and I are talking right now, Chiron will actually get back to that discovery degree. So that means that'll be the first time that we've lived through Chiron moving all the way through the zodiac and coming back around full circle since its discovery. So there, we would think there is actually something more essential about the full meaning of Chiron that will be emerging. And that's something I think will also be really interesting to track and pay attention to in these like first 3 months this year of what we start
Hmm.
seeing happening with it.
Yeah, and I like that you brought up about the crafts and how Taurus is associated with like craftsmanship
Hmm.
and, sort of like that slow sort of care and cultivation and creating something of, and then Taurus being an earth sign, usually something like tangible. But even if it's not tangible, I think a lot of, say, artist types that have Taurus signatures, are considered like craftsmen. And someone who's very chironic to me is the actor Michael Fassbender, and he was born in 1977, and he has Chiron at 0 degrees
Mm.
of Taurus, and it's like at the top of his chart. And he also has that Jupiter in Taurus as well at the end of Taurus at 29 degrees. But what struck me so interesting about him was he broke through with this film called Hunger. Actually, he had two kind of breakthroughs. I think he broke through to like European audiences in this film, Hunger, which is about the activist Bobby Sands in Ireland and how he, went on a hunger strike, and Michael Fassbender lost a lot of weight for that. He's an Irish German actor, I should probably mention too. And so, because of Chiron and Taurus specifically being associated with sort of the biological survival, and like we were talking about, like sort of the poverty consciousness, I thought that was just so archetypally like spot on about activating sort of that archetype. And also, Michael Fassbender, he was interviewed about, his craft, and he's considered, an actor's actor, like one of the great actors of his generation. And he had said that his work just is never good enough for him. Like no matter how many accolades he gets and awards and reviews or whatever, it's never good enough. And that sort of good enough thing makes me think of the shadow of Taurus, which can be about, um, not having the self-worth, because when we think of Taurus, the second house, about value and worth, it's also reflecting on the self, what is the self-worth? And that is something that is a very internal process. And no matter, if you're looking at it from externally, trying to get external validation, it might never fill that Chiron wound. That Chiron wound has to be, and especially with Taurus being a more introverted sign, that healing has to be on the inner level. Oh, I had also said the other film that Michael Fassbender broke through with was one called Shame, which was also by, believe it was by the same director that the artist Steve McQueen, who's a director as well. And it was about, this experience of shame, really. So I'm like, here's the other Chiron and Taurus
Mm.
archetype on shame and healing shame. And oftentimes with a feeling like shame, it's something that is like an internal journey that a person has to go through in order to find the healing. And it did make me think of that shame that was put on people during the Industrial Revolution, where it's like, if you were poor, you know, you were a moral failure. And that was the other thing that Martin Luther King would also say too. He was just like, you people are poor and it is not your fault. It's essentially helping people to see it's the system. And there's actually nothing shameful about being poor. And so I'm wondering if that kind of conversation may come up again too when people, are we're sort of awakened to the fact that, poor isn't, a moral stain on someone. And then maybe a whole, hopefully, as you said, that Chiron can be a journey that because it's a teacher and a mentor, that we can come to a new understanding of, how we relate to our own sense of shame and failure, um, that might not even be ours to own in that sense.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. The hunger strike example is interesting because we're already seeing hunger strikes happening in different places and some of the detention centers in the related to the United States. So I could definitely see that coming in more. And I mean, maybe it'd be helpful to talk a bit too about just what Chiron means, and a little bit about just like the archetype related to, because I would speak to what you're just talking to about. Um, because you want to think about, we have Taurus, right, which is it's an earth sign, so that's where we're getting a lot of this material stuff we're talking about. It's a sign of Venus. It's the exaltation of the moon. So there's a lot of stuff here about, yeah, material level and growth and providing and having the stability that we want mentally and physically to nurture and to create um, and so Chiron coming in with like how we're talking, that's where we're really seeing this intersection of how it's going to impact this sign, which is obviously also interesting because Uranus has been there for so long, already shaking up the Taurus parts of our chart, and then we basically get Chiron coming in behind that. So, I
Well, I
mean,
did
one of the
want to
things,
also mention, I did, if I could insert something
yeah,
there
yeah.
too, is like, I would also have people look at, if you're looking at your natal chart and you're, wondering about this terrain that Chiron is going through in
Mm,
Taurus, yes, look at that Uranus was there since what, 2018, I think it was, it entered
hmm
Taurus, and then it just recently
hmm
left in this year, 2026. But then also we had Jupiter going through Taurus. Just when was it? Was it 2023 or something? It wasn't that long ago. Let's see. We got years
Yeah, it was part 2023 and then also in 2024.
2023, 2024. And then, but we also had, let me see, and the North Node and Jupiter, North Node, Jupiter, and Uranus were in Taurus in 2023. Yeah. And let me see. And
Yeah, and there were
2022.
eclipses in 2022 with it. Yep.
So, um, in a way, like a lot of that kind of nourished, and brought kind of some, hopefully, the Uranian sort of excitement and chaos or whatever. But I generally we think of growth and nourishment and things like that. When I think of Jupiter going through Taurus and the North Node. Um, but now with Chiron, that can bring a different sense. I think we may feel we're talking a lot about the pain and the wounding and things like that, but Chiron does bring in opportunities. I mean, I would just even think of Chiron going through Aries and, you know, there was also a lot of other things happening through Aries too, right? With Saturn and Neptune and whatever. But I think as a collective, we started seeing the sort of sacred rage where standing up for things and speaking out and things like that were actually becoming a lot more of almost even a moral duty to do if there was something to speak up about. And so I think it was also, healing the wound around the shame of the Aries archetype of rage and that sort of thing. And so, I would kind of take that lens also to look at how would that be applied to Taurus.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and Chiron, again, coming back to his discovery degree is so important next June, around June 8th. But we'll definitely get it activated now. I mean, when it was discovered, it was the first of these celestial beings that we now call centaurs. So even like the astronomical classification's gone with it, and it's not to me ever been completely. It doesn't seem to even to now be completely clearly defined what they actually even are. I mean, there's interesting things about them. Like Chiron even has some rings and it has a really strange orbit. But I mean, most people, I think it's pretty commonly accepted that it's something that comes from the Kuiper belt. So we're talking about, you know, deep space, you know, way out where Pluto is and Eris and everything else beyond. And I've
Now,
always really, yeah.
is it a comet too? Because I've heard it's also a comet slash
That's what they
planetoid.
have said before, but I don't think, yeah, I feel like the comet, and that's the thing is I'm not up on it all. I don't feel like the comet designation has persisted. Yeah, but there was definitely thought of it being a wondering if it was a comet at one point. I mean, a lot of these like they actually have been called centaurs, which is kind of funny.
Well, AI, if that says anything on Google, says that yes, Chiron is a comet. It's officially
Okay,
designated as
maybe it still isn't.
95P Chiron.
Okay.
It functions as a rare asteroid slash comet hybrid, often referred to as a centaur. So maybe that's what they, and
Yeah, so
discovered in
even
1977. Oh,
yeah.
1977. That was the year that Michael Fassbender was born.
Yeah. So that's the thing. Even the way AI was just describing that, they were like, "Well, it's a comet, but it's also an asteroid, some kind of weird hybrid." That's just what I mean, where it's not like it's got a hybrid, and obviously the mythical archetype that was given the name is a hybrid. It's a half human, half animal. And what I think is so fascinating about that, you know, related to all this, when you brought up shame, I mean, that is one of the interesting correspondences the with Chiron gaining its mythic name because it does seem to go with shame pretty working through issues like that and self-worth pretty consistently wherever it's going to be moving through whatever sign. And of course, Chiron's father is Kronos, or the Roman Saturn, who turns into a horse to mate with seduce and mate with a nymph, and this half human, half horse being Chiron is born, and in this case, he is rejected. Like his parents reject him,
Yes, that
and
was the
he then
original wound, right? The original wound was
yeah.
that
So
rejection wound.
yep. So he's rejected for who he is as this half human, half animal, and he's fostered in part by the sun and the moon, by Apollo and Artemis, and then grows into being this guide who, just like he himself was fostered, and he learns from them things like hunting from Artemis and healing and medicinal things from Apollo. And he becomes this great healer and great hunter and this great mentor and trainer of all the Greek heroes. They're all brought to him to for him to mentor and foster before they go off into their great heroic mythic journeys. So when what's so fascinating is all of those themes are just so alive with what Chiron means and how it mediates between all these things. Even just the symbol of being half horse, half animal, half human, this deep instinctual combined with intellect. Because unlike the other Chirons, which are typically described as ravenous and overly impulsive and overly wild, Chiron is seen as the more intellectual, rational. You know, there's something about him that stands out as this very wise and kind being. So what's kind of interesting about that mythic symbolism and this object, right? It's a weird hybrid object. It comes from way out in deep space where, you know, likely everything in our system comes out of there in one way or another. So there's a way that the astrologer Melanie Reinhardt talks about Chiron I really love, which is that in the way that deep kind of like almost like it's like the graveyard or the underworld, deep underworld of space where Pluto is like the lord of this Kuiper Belt region that's like far out there, which, in the way we do associate Pluto with these deep, like the deepest layers of desire and aspects of ourselves. And when Pluto transit just like pulls, all the depths up right out of the collective in transits, and this deep, seemingly small material becomes these huge events and collective eruptions. So Chiron like comes from out there, but then is like this intermediary, like liminal guide figure that somehow has this weird orbit that comes all the way at some points within the orbit of Saturn. And then when Chiron is in Aries, where it's when Chiron is far out to Uranus. So this way that Chiron weaves in between Uranus and Saturn and moves between those two realms is another one of the really key symbols of Chiron. And that's the great break in astrology even. And what's so fascinating about Chiron being the first object discovered and being given its name, and because when Uranus was discovered, it completely disrupted the order, and we no longer had just these seven or five visible wandering planets on top of the sun and the moon, and now we had this whole other realm of planets, like including Neptune and then later Pluto. And so there is something about weaving in between Saturn, the realm of Saturn, the realm of Uranus, that Chiron is also between the deep instinctual, between spirit, psyche and matter, all like these deep themes, and it carries all these wounds, but also carries this potential for renewal. And sometimes issues of Chiron are not necessarily something that can actually be fully healed, but they can be worked with or moved. And people often, whatever that wound or that issue is related to Chiron, it's something that can feed their art or their creativity or their vocation. And they somehow transmute this, whatever that issue is, it can go out into the world and then work with to mentor and guide and help others that are dealing with the same issue, right? Um, so there's just something, those are, so there's when we're talking about there is really something like really deep seated about the Taurus sign and the Taurus archetype that Chiron's going to be activating.
Because Chiron has a lot of times has dealt very almost literally with mentorship. And of course,
Right.
Chiron's the wound people always associate with Chiron in mythology is having had been, poison arrow to the thigh, right? And then that would never heal. That's the other thing I think that's interesting. And correct me if I, miss anything on the mythology part, but that it was the poison arrow through the thigh, which caused him
Mm,
incredible pain. And Chiron was an immortal. And even though he discovered all of these things to help heal him, and it never fully healed him, but it was like discoveries that benefited, humanity. But he finally realized the only way he would get out of the pain would be to ask the gods if he could sort of become mortal so he could die of this wound so that he could finally be free of this like eternal pain. And to me, Chiron also has very much to do with being humbled, because and humbling oneself is the way that we connect to our humanity, to being human. Because when we're so overblown with ego and what have you, then we can't really feel connected, to our own humanity. Like that to me is just sort of a connection that I've always made with Chiron, that there is some, a necessary humbling that actually is, can actually connect us to our deeper self.
yeah, well, another version of that is that so I mentioned earlier the father of Chiron is Kronos. He's essentially Saturn. And remember, Chiron comes into the orbit of Saturn, and so there's all these Saturn themes that can come, which can be things like maturation and growing in wisdom over time and removing yourself as like an ascetic or like a hermit or like a recluse or like a rebel away from the system to kind of like go out on your own and get this deeper spiritual mystical awareness from Saturn. But Saturn can also be the scarcity shaming kind of things like we were talking about. But then Prometheus is a figure who Rick Tarnas made famous as an archetype and deity associated with the planet Uranus. And I think the most popular version of his death is he has the he Prometheus is chained to a rock and being tortured because he stole fire to give to humanity. And Chiron, there's different versions of this, but in one of the versions, Chiron gives himself up, and that to then release Prometheus, and so they kind of exchange places, and then he's he's because Prometheus is being tortured by this eagle of Zeus. So then Chiron is like lifted up to the heavens. That's one of the versions of that, as well as the fact that that incurable wound he received was from Heracles, who was one of his mentees. So he had
Mm.
mentored and fostered Heracles, and that incurable poison was from the great serpent, the Hydra, who is from like Lake Lerna in Greece, which was like a well-known like underworld portal. It's one of the very early trials of Heracles. You know, he like wrestles the Nemean lion. He takes the skin of the Nemean lion to like wear as this almost like a talismanic protective thing. And then he also when he slays the Hydra, he the Hydra has this incurable poison, and the arrows are dipped in that. So he's using that on all his trials. And there's a wayward arrow that strikes Chiron. So yeah, there is a thing where he's like struck by the one of these figures that he had actually he's wounded by one of the figures he had mentored and fostered and everything. And one thing about Chiron going into Taurus just is that it is going to square Pluto and Aquarius. Now, that won't really happen these next few months, but from June 19th to September 17th, Chiron is in Taurus. Pluto is not too far into Aquarius. They're not going to get that close together, but they'll be within, like 5 degrees or so of one another. So
Oh.
it is going to start getting activated. And when this really comes in strong will be um, in 2028. I'm just realizing I don't know if I know for sure when the exact date of the Pluto Chiron square is, but I know that when in July of so in June 8th of so 2 years from now, so next year in 20 June of 2027 is when Chiron returns to his discovery degree. June of 2028 is when Saturn is in Taurus, and Saturn forms a conjunction with Chiron. And then July of 2028 is when Chiron and Taurus forms a square to Pluto. But it will not just be that June and July of 2028 will be Saturn with Chiron and Taurus forming a square to Pluto and Aquarius, which will be the first Saturn Pluto square since the 2020 conjunction that went with the pandemic and the lockdowns and everything else. So it's a really loaded moment that's coming. And there is something about the Mars square Pluto to some degree. It's not the same thing as that, but it is going to be around the same degrees with that issue you were
Oh.
just talking about. But certainly, I mean, there's something we can see that there's going to be something enormously important about this Chiron and Taurus transit that's going to hit really hard in 2028. We're getting a little ahead of ourselves here, but that's when we're going to have Chiron and Saturn in Taurus, square Pluto and Aquarius. That's a
Ooh.
significant transit for us to all
I,
go through, right? Yeah.
well, I like to have the bigger picture because it's like,
Yeah.
okay, it's really important we do our Chiron homework, our Chiron and Taurus
Yeah.
homework, so that, because I do think that there is that. I would think that at its best, Chiron and Taurus can help us find some inner resiliency so that we aren't, the shame that is festering doesn't keep us stuck. Stuck is kind of sort of this shadow keyword for Taurus. Doesn't keep us stuck, doesn't keep us in shame, doesn't keep us, turning on ourselves. In some ways, I think that the vulnerability, because there's this shame and vulnerability thing of Chiron, that could even be our strength, because it's like, again, rather than denying, our vulnerable areas, when we can accept them, they say is that the medicine is in the wound. That's like sort of part of the lesson of Chiron. Um, then we don't, have to feel almost defeated by them, defeated before things happen, because then the Saturn and Pluto, those are going to sort of be bigger and louder. But I think it's important to do that, to understand, the value of the Chiron work in Taurus. So yeah,
Yeah,
thank you
and there'll
for that.
definitely be something really, I think something will really be emerging, and it's not all going to be negative. So there will be, I think there's, with all this changing, like we're seeing, like we're going to have to collectively, um, you would imagine a lot of reconnection actually with the body and the wisdom within the body, the intelligence within nature, um, stepping back from over, finding ways to mediate this increased technological disruption. Going with all this technology is also, you know, already in some places, but increasingly greater potential for, various survey. I mean, there's already surveillance states in place, but there's things that could be or can be coming into form that are even more extremes in some of these ways that could also be tied into currency and different things like that, right? With resources. So I think like Chiron and Taurus to me really just feels like the great ultimate like antidote to how to mediate this period that we're going through. And there's I think even thinking again about that half horse, half human, that deep mediating between the deep instinctual, the deep inner soul that we can make contact with, as well as spiritual awarenesses and spiritual practices that we can be working with different. Chiron is especially an archetype that goes really well with anything holistic, all sorts of holistic forms of healing and medicine and general awareness and mind body connections. So there's hopefully a lot of things like this that can be um, coming in, and hopefully helping to mediate it in helpful ways and help us, stay connected to our own bodies and beings and um, the deep awareness that can come out of our inner senses and how that can, connect us into our higher purposes and our higher callings and everything else. Chiron's always meeting this material and spiritual layer. Melanie Reinhardt's also somebody that's, I mentioned her before, talking about Chiron kind of like mediating our realm with this like vast Pluto Kuiper Belt underworld. So she's made a lot of connections of Chiron also really mediating our ancestral connections and our ancestral issues, which also speaks really to our ancestral guides that we can have and beings and presences that can show up that are, quite like daimon kind of guiding aspects of our life and our relations. So there's what's also kind of interesting about all of that, and that there is this um, there's something very like even like the collect like C.G. Jung's notion of like the collective unconscious and how things show up in our reality from these places that Chiron seems to mediate to me. And there is with we in astrology we talk about the planet the lunar nodes, right? You mentioned the lunar nodes earlier with like the eclipses, and there's the south node of the moon and the north node of the moon. And a lot of times the north node of the moon gets that like overly material, but also like growth, and different systems will perceive it differently. But it does tend to, and all the systems have something to do with like material desires and kind of a hunger for something. And then the South Node, especially the way it's portrayed as K2 and Jyotish, is more of that immaterial opening a spiritual liberation from the material consumption. That's one of the ways the South Node can show up. And certainly like a place of like release and shedding as well. We could even, think about perhaps like the snake shedding its skin. So
Mm.
all the planets, all the objects, including Chiron, also have their own nodes. And the south node of Chiron, well, now if we're talking heliocentric versus geocentrically, there's a difference, but the geocentric nodes are from our perspective here on Earth. And so the geocentric south node of Chiron, depending on what time of year it is, it shifts from Aries into Taurus. And when I was looking this up before we spoke, it'll be in February of 2027 that we will have a exact Chiron conjunction with its geocentric south node in Aries at about 27 degrees of Aries. But in this general time period, if you look at a chart with like Chiron, the geocentric south node of Chiron, along with Chiron, you'll see Chiron in Taurus with the south node in Taurus, not too far away. So we are coming into a period too where there's something also interesting about the that mind body connection that you were just talking about. And while I think there might be something with like where are we overly where maybe with like the economic classes issues and things like this, and people, there's people just taking there's extreme corruption, mind-boggling corruption and greed and scarcity mindsets like running with people that just have I mean I don't know how to even describe it, but it's really just gross, completely inequitable wealth disparities, right? Um, and so there's something about interesting about Chiron, being on its own south node in this time period as it leaves Aries to go into Taurus, and it's going to cross over its own south node. That I think whatever we're dealing with the material, I do think it's going to bring in some kind of really important spiritual realizations and spiritual awarenesses. It doesn't mean you need to live as like an ascetic and like give everything up and go off and live in a cave in the wilderness away from everything, but like, you know, um,
But it doesn't mean you can't do that.
you can do that too. And I think there will be people like leaving going
Mm,
off grid
going
more and
off
more
grid.
probably. But then that would make sense with Chiron and Taurus for sure. But yeah, I think I think there's going to be really important awarenesses and realizations about all of this, and hopefully it can end up being part of important movements and changes that can also then impact the way economics work and everything in a
Hmm.
more positive way.
Oh, I do also want to emphasize that Melanie Reinhardt, I think, is just incredible as well,
Yeah.
with her reflections on Chiron. And what I liked, what she had said about it too, is that Chiron sometimes, and I guess often, can accompany, a health issue or a health matter. But I like how she says it's accompanied by a health matter, but it's not about the health matter. Like in her mind, it's kind of this shamanic energy where maybe the health matter is pointing to some other imbalance. Because I have seen
Mm-hmm.
people say things like, oh, yeah, my Chiron return, that's when I broke my leg, or that's when I got menopause or whatever, but it's
Mm-hmm.
like, yes, and, it's not just about the physical symptoms, at least according to someone like Melanie Reinhardt, because it's there, as you said, it's a teacher, it's a mentor, it's meant to point to something greater. Because there's often times where people can have, say they get cancer and then they get the surgery to remove the cancer. But if the conditions that created that aren't changed, it'll come back, and I think that's another thing to think about with Chiron,
Mm.
especially when it has something to do with maybe a medical issue or a health issue. And sometimes when we do suffer some kind of a health issue, then it's like sometimes it is saving us and it's pointing us to something else. Like, when you can't, when you have to be present with, some pain or something like that, what is it showing you about yourself? What is it showing you about your life and things like that? So that's why I like to look at Chiron. I mean, I think there are some people who really, when it comes to Chiron transit, the first thing they think of is, oh, I might have a health issue. But, I think it's so much bigger than that.
Yeah, I agree. So with whatever's going on, and you might have something like that, and there certainly could be just very obvious medical things you need to be attending to. But yeah, there is a way that where the various symptoms that we're dealing with in all sorts of areas of our life, just really being curious and following the threads of those symptoms. I mean, it's actually making me think, and for a moment, I just had a thought of like Ariadne and the labyrinth holding like the Minotaur, who's like a bull man. But anyway, just follow, like going within that labyrinth, following the threads, because there's going to likely be, it's with Chiron, it's like you're saying, there's typically a larger field of issues and things that are being shown by that, and these symptoms are going to be pointing you places, and they could be pointing you to very material bodily things. They may also be pointing you to spiritual aspects of things, yeah, that need to be honored as well. I'm realizing we haven't spoken about the Chiron returns. Maybe before we go, we should mention that quickly, at
Ah,
least that if you have Chiron in Taurus, so even if you have Chiron like much later in Taurus, like we were looking up ahead of time some more recent people. So like Beyonce, for example, I saw has Chiron in Taurus. I think she has it around like 22 or 23 Taurus. So if you're somebody like that has Chiron much later, like I have Chiron at 22, 23 Aries. So when Chiron first went into Aries, I can't say that was like my peak Chiron return time period, but I did notice a lot of the themes of that Chiron return were starting to show up in my life in ways that obviously became much more intensified once I got to the degree range of like being within like 3 to 5 degrees or so of my Chiron return, and that's been like the real peak of it. But if you have Chiron and Taurus anywhere, definitely you want to be paying extra attention to it. It's Chiron's cycle is really odd because of its weird orbit. So for most of the signs, we can't line up things like everybody gets a Chiron square at one age because they're all over the place. But we all get the Chiron return at age 50. It's like the one thing where it comes back around at a particular date for all of us. So it is always going to be that transition into the 50s. If you are somebody that has a spiritual practice or something somewhere in the realm of astrology, like if you're listening to this podcast, these are, like the Chiron return can tend to be a really important stage of development for that. And it's a really crucial transition that you face. And there might be, I definitely ended up having a pretty core wound of mine, some issues relating to that there was a part of my karma return where this was showing up in my life in a way for me to relate to again. But I would say for myself at least, I also just had really a lot of like maturation and honing of skills and taking things to another level with my various practices and work over the course of the Chiron return and found it really to be a overall really deep and important stage of growth and development and process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, me too. And my Chiron is also is I believe it's 24, the
Mm,
23 or 24, something like that. Aries, in the third house, fourth house, depending on house system. And I'm glad you brought that up that because sometimes people think like, oh, my Chiron return isn't until, or my whatever return isn't until it gets to 2 to 3 degrees or the degree that the planet is in the natal chart. But why not start looking for, what the meaning could be as soon as, because I feel as you do, as soon as that planet enters that sign, you start to, get some information.
mhm,
So you might as well prepare yourself. And I feel like my independence was something that I had kind of given up for, having sort of a safe job and things like that. In 2022, I took a day job in higher education, but I also felt just the more and the more the pinch of that, like, where is it, where am I not free to just be independent? And I also have Jupiter in Aries, like I really just love to learn, to teach, to explore, areas of the mind and stuff. And so it just felt more and more uncomfortable to not have that. And it made me really start to see that, I started to find ways to bring it into my life. I think that Chiron's another thing is about adaptability. It's like adapting to, the wound or the vulnerability or something like that. And so I was just
mhm.
trying to find ways to weave in my sense of independence and everything like that. I felt like turning 50 was the first time I really felt like, oh my God, I'm entering an entirely new decade. And what do I want this decade? How do I want to define this next decade?
Mhm.
I didn't necessarily feel like that at any other, decade turning point. But at 50, it felt pretty monumental because
Yeah.
it's like, what am I going to have the energy for? What should I say no to so that I can really give more of my energy and focus to how I want to live?
Mhm.
That was a lot of the sort of Chiron return for me.
Carl Jung, I think, is the person that really made the wounded healer archetype very popular, not less so much with astrology, more with the therapeutic, being therapeutic relationship. But he's famous for this whole idea of like holding the tension of the opposites and mediating, between these realms of psyche and matter and spirit and whatnot. So that's what Chiron really takes you through a deep process of it, and it's going to be liminal. It's going to be some kind of initiation. There is some type of a dark night of the soul that tends to come with it. Some kind of, Chiron lives in this deep cave. It's a very shamanic cave mentor guide figure. And you go into that cave, but you discover, mysteries and revelations and deeper understandings of yourself, right? And you can get guided and come out with, yeah, more aligned with all of that.
One of my absolute favorite trips I ever took was I went to the south of France to visit the grotto of Mary Magdalene.
Oh,
There's
wow.
this like chapel inside of this cave that's on like the side of a mountain that you can
Beautiful.
hike
Yeah.
to, and it's dedicated to Mary Magdalene. Supposedly that's where she when she landed in France and she did all these
Wow.
miracles and healings, and it's where people come to pray and give
Yeah.
offerings for healing.
Beautiful.
And so I was thinking of the cave, and it's so worth it. And I've always said I need to go back one day. So I love that there's that
Yeah.
sort of
That's
association with the
amazing.
Chiron.
I've
Hmm.
heard about that place and I would love to go to it. That also reminds me, actually, one of the things that I experienced with my Chiron return was, which was a really new thing, was going to, with my friend and colleague Jason Hawley, helped facilitate like a group tour of going to different sacred sites in Greece, which was really a powerful experience and really felt like that was when my Chiron return was happening, and it felt like one of the main things. And we actually we originally were going to go later this year, and because of the economic crisis that started happening, we we pulled out of it and are now planning next year. It'll be before Chiron gets to its degree return, but it'll probably be like in May leading up to it. I don't think it's been fully announced, but if people are interested, I'll put things on my site about it. And because we are going to go to one of the Chiron sites as part of that. So
Wow.
as part of that tour, as well as one of the sites of Asclepius, who is the great healer, who is another one of the people Chiron helped to mentor and brought all those healing gifts to. So, yeah, if that's something people are interested in, you can just follow my site, and you'll see, or Jason's site, and you'll see us announce that when it's happening.
Well, thank you so much, Gray. This is always such a pleasure. And I hope you can come back for part two of the Chiron and Taurus with all we've learned.
Yeah, so
All
June
right.
19th to September 17th. That's those are the dates. So really pay attention to what happens when it goes in.
Everyone, you can check out the show notes. I'll have the links to Gray's website, and we look forward to seeing you next time.